Last year, my goal was to read 5 books. Y'all gonna be like, bitch, 5 books? Do you even read? Sometimes. Year before that, my goal was 10 books, and I only read 2. So I decided to start having more realistic goals for myself. The last book that I read of 2024 took me 6 months to read. I know the Dallas Public Library was mad as shit. It took me 6 months to return that book. So I read 5 books last year. I only own the physical copy of 2 of these books, and I don't feel like getting them. And those books would be The Children of Blood and Bone and Monday's Not Coming. The other 3 books I read, I supported my local library and checked them out. You should support your local library. Go get a library card. It's free. It's free. Oh my god. You don't know how much media you have free access to when you get a library card. Oh my god, let me go on a tangent. I love the public library. The reason why I am a bookworm is because of the public library. Okay, let me tell you why. Basically, growing up, me and my brother grew up during the time where we're starting to transition into needing to use the internet and things like typing and computers and stuff like that for homework. So we frequented the library because we had like a really old box computer that just was like not reliable. We didn't own a printer, whatever. So after school, me and my brother would go to the library so he could do his homework, and I would sit and just read books all day. And eventually my grandma ended up getting like a library card on my behalf so I can like check out books and take them home. I would like go to the programs that they would host at the library. So they'll be like, one time there was a puppet show, they would put on movies. One time they did this workshop where they taught us how to make zines, little books as they called them. And I would go to those programs even over the summer. And I went to those programs over the summer even after like I moved to Texas. I would visit my grandma every summer for 3 months, and I would still go to those programs up until I was like 12 years old. And yes, I would be the oldest in the crowd. I never gave a fuck. And so that's like actually why I'm a bookworm. A huge part of it is because of the public library. I didn't buy all the books that I read growing up. Most of them were checked out. Now I do own a significant portion of childhood books that like, everybody buys for their kids when they're babies and toddlers, but majority of the books that I read throughout my entire life, I checked out from the public library or from my school library when that became an option available to me. So I love the public library. Support your local library. It's literally free. Go do it immediately if you are able. So the first book that I read was Children of Blood and Bone by, I can't say her name, so I don't want to fuck it up. So I'm putting it here. Hey, I love fantasy. Love fantasy down. I particularly love African fantasy. I feel like African fantasy always has such a layer of depth that other fantasies just don't have. Like African fantasies, I'm sorry, they eat all the other fantasy subgenres up. I'm sorry. If the option is an African fantasy or any other body's fantasy novel, I'm picking the African fantasy. Actually, the first African fantasy novel I read was Akata Witch in my sophomore year of high school. I don't remember the author, but that was my first introduction to African fantasy, and I was like, nah, wait a minute. They did not only nibble, chew, but they ate, like they devoured even. So I've always been on the search for more African fantasies, but they're kind of few and far in between. Now I find that in recent years, with more and more just like authors of color being put on the forefront, they're starting to become more of a known thing, a more like substantial subgenre. So I definitely will be reading more African fantasies in the future. But yeah, that was my second 5 out of 5 read that I read last year. I'm gonna say this: none of these books have lower than a 3.5, and it's because I don't read bad books. I do a lot of research on books before I decide which ones I'm gonna read. And you mean, like, how do you do research on it without it getting spoiled for you? I just look at what other people are saying. I like to watch like spoiler-free reviews where they're describing like the plot of the book, and I can tell easily from a plot of a book if it's going to be for me or if it's not going to be for me, because I'm very particular about the type of literature that I read. I'm a person who requires a lot of depth to my literature. I can't read surface level frou bullshit. I remember I made a TikTok DNFing Take a Hit Danny Brown. I had to DNF that book because like it had like literally no substance. I couldn't take it. I didn't really like the writing style. It was just like I didn't understand And like I was so excited to read that book and eventually the series because everybody talked about like how good it is. I was like, girl, this ain't got no substance. I am bored. Like, and it was just like I didn't like the writing, so I need books that really intellectually stimulate me, but I need there to be something to read in between the lines. Like I need substance. I need something to bite into that I could sink my teeth into. That being said, I immediately know based off of a book's a description if it's gonna be that for me. So that's why I don't really read bad books. It's very rare that I read a book that I have to be enough. I'm so excited to see what the future books hold, and I know they're turning them into movies. I will definitely be like watching them when they come out, and this will be the first like book to movie adaptation where I have actually read the book before the movie comes out. So second book that I read that last year was Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. This was my number one, for last year. So Children of Blood and Bone would be my number 2. Monday's Not Coming is my number 1. That's like a 10 out of 5. Baby, it broke the scale. That book was literally so ingenious in so ways, and the content and the subject matter is very depressing, but I was just really impressed by the prose, especially because this is a book taken from the perspective of like a middle school, early high school age student, and yet it was a story that was so complex despite being from the point of view of someone in their adolescence. They didn't dumb down the language too much, but they still made it a bit relatable and accurate to the age. And I really like how this book didn't dumb down the intelligence of the main character either because of their age. So I was really impressed by the writing of this book. I found a lot of books that are from the point of view of middle schoolers or teenagers nowadays. This used to not be a problem when I was actively a middle school and like high schooler reading books about other middle schoolers and high schoolers. I felt like this is a newfound problem where a lot of modern authors are trying to take too many liberties with their language in order to better match the descriptors of the demographic, like of the different demographics they're writing about, and it ends up just being such a huge disconnect, and the prose ends up reading really awfully. But I found this book did a really good job at kind of altering the language a little bit to make it accurate to a teenager, specifically where they're from. But they did it so successfully, and just like believe kids. Children are so smart and so bright. Believe kids. Oh my god, that book had me on the edge. The edge. I think that's probably the fastest I read a book last year was Monday's Not Coming. So that was my number 1. Number 3, and the fourth book I read last year, but it's at the number 3 spot, is gonna be Thin Girls by Diana Clark. I actually got this recommendation from Lily Reese, which is also As Told by Kenya. She owns a reading channel, and so I'm very picky about who I take book recommendations from because, like I said, not everybody's an intellectual reader. When I was watching a video and she mentioned this book, my ears immediately perked up. I went on my library's online catalog, saw they had it, ordered it, got it. This book was such a beautiful like exploration of like sisterhood, queerness, trigger warning, like disordered eating. And what I loved about this book was the casual queerness of it. There's another book that actually I'm just not realizing 3 out of the 5 books I read last year had casual queerness, which I'm gonna explain what that means in a little bit. But I love books that have more casual queerness, like very human way of talking about kind of like mental health disorders, talking about like queerness, talking about the body, and like because she had a lot of conversations about like her body in relation to her eating disorder, and like the way that her eating disorder wasn't directly correlated to necessarily not liking her body, but wanting control, wanting to be liked, wanting to fit in, etc., etc. I thought that was such a well-rounded way of discussing eating disorders that was beyond surface. And I feel like a lot of conversations around eating disorders don't really reach that level of depth or complexity. So that's like one thing I immediately have to like applaud about the book. It was a really good read. Like thinking back on it, it's a book I would easily read again. In the number 4 spot, but it was the last book I read of the year, the one that took me 6 months, was Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. Now this book, you gotta hold on, because it was starting off real slow and I was starting to not see the point, and it was just real sad for a really long time, like a really, really long time in the book. I was starting not to see the point, but eventually it just wrapped up so beautifully, and I was like, wow. Like, I relate so much to kind of like her plight and her main, goal throughout the whole book. And though I'm not someone who dealt with a mother with addiction, and I didn't go through, as much trauma as she had throughout the book, I just related so much to the whole thing of like wanting to save your family, but having to save yourself first, and kind of like that battle between that, wanting to be in tune where you're from, but having to sacrifice a little bit of that in order to do better and get better for your family. And it was just so realistic, talking about like the sacrifices a lot of young black girls have to make in order to uplift them, not only themselves but their family. And also sometimes the sacrifice of like, sometimes you have to uplift yourself and you're the only person that gets uplifted in the end. Now that ended up not being the case in this book, but sometimes in life it looks that way for a very long time, like you're the only person you've uplifted, because uplifting your family is a whole nother battle. And I just deeply related to her plight, was so highly relatable to me as a black person, that I couldn't stand to give it anything less than like a 3.5. Book in the number 5 spot, but it was the third book I read last year, was Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Wong. I think this is like another like 3.5 read. This book is like a little bit of body horror, thriller, suspense. It's like one of those things that doesn't go into like a really strict, over like encompassing genre, but it's just about this girl who is working at this beauty shop that has a lot of secrets, and they doing a lot of grimy stuff for the sake of this beauty. And by the end, her body ends up being like completely morphed, shifted, changed, and disabled in some ways, in the sake of beauty. And I think this was just a really interesting exploration of kind of the things people do in search for beauty, but then also like kind of the complexities of that, with her also being the child of an immigrant, and kind of be somebody who had this huge like prestige and expectation to her when she was younger, and now she like stays in somebody's basement and works this like rinky dinky like retail job and everything. So I really love those complexities. Once again, this is a book that had cash O'Quinn. The only thing was like they like rushed through the ending of the book, and I felt like if they would have given me like 50 more pages, I would have like ranked it a little bit higher. But it was still a really good book. Like, I just like when books put a subject that seemingly seems very plain and in your face, and just like dissects it in a way that you may not have like thought about it before. In this case, they use like a very extreme example of what body modification can look like in order to have beauty, and like the money complex that kind of goes behind that, in order to illustrate that point. But I still think it was beautifully done. So those were all 5 books that I read, ranked in order of kind of like how much I enjoyed them. But like I said, nothing was below a 3.5 for me, because I only read good books. This year I'm planning to read 7 books. On top of that, I'm planning to read more black classics. I'm actually currently reading The Color Purple with my mommy, and then the next book I'll be reading is Their Eyes Were Watching God, which I saw that my library does have available, so I will be reserving very soon. Those were all my spoiler-free reviews. If you want me to get like more in-depth reviews about the books that I read, just let me know. I can always make separate videos on them, because these all go on the same channel, so I don't really mind. But I love reading. I love books. I love mental stimulation.